Welcome to Lamar University. We're so glad you could be with us tonight. This academic lecture series was created by our students. Our students voted to fund this series with their student activity fees. Of course, we're so delighted to have literary legend Professor Doctorow with us this evening and tomorrow. You'll be visiting with students and faculty in the morning. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Joanne Stiles, who will introduce our speaker for tonight.
Well, I know you can see on this program that I'm not the person that was supposed to be here. The chairman of this series is Dr. Sally Shepard, the chairman of the English department at Lamar. And she was going home from work Friday night, twisted a foot and hurt her back and cannot be here tonight. But in her place, I'd like to, first of all, read you a little bit of the introduction that she had prepared for Professor Doctorow. Sally said, "Our guest this evening has established himself among America's most distinguished living writers." My comment was, it's a good thing, the living writer part, I mean. Better than the possibilities. A native of New York, he was educated at Kenyon College and Columbia University. From 1956 to 59, he was a script editor for Columbia Pictures, then served as a senior editor for the New American Library and as editor-in-chief for Dial Press during the 1960s. Over the years, he's taught at the University of California, Sarah Lawrence College, the Yale University Drama School, Princeton University, and New York University. His novels include Welcome to Hard Times, Big as Life, The Book of Daniel, Loon Lake, Lives of the Poets, The Waterworks, and City of God, which is his most recent book. And I was reading that and I said, where's Ragtime? Where, in next paragraph. For his third novel, Ragtime, he received the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Arts and Letters Award. For World's Fair, published in 1985, he received the National Book Award in 1986. And for Billy Bathgate, published in 1989, he received the National Book Award nomination, the National Critics Circle Award, the Penn Faulkner Award, and the William Dean Howells Medal of the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. Among his other literary works are the play Drinks Before Dinner, the screenplay Daniel, and numerous essays and works of short fiction. His short story Baby Wilson appeared in the March 25th issue of the New Yorker just last month. In addition to holding a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Creative Artist Program Service Fellowship, he was named New York State Author in 1989 and 91 and received the Edith Wharton Citation of Merit for Fiction, the National Humanities Award, and the Commonwealth Award in 2000. In 1984, he was named to the American Academy and National Institute of Arts and Letters. From the outset, E.L. Doctorow's fiction has elicited praise and provoked controversy for its challenges to genre conventions, its stylistic innovations, and its startling evocations of American cultural history. As one source puts it, Doctorow's work is characterized by serious philosophical probings, a subtle and diverse prose style, and placement of historical figures in unusual, sometimes bizarre situations and settings, unquote. Now, a personal comment along with that, I met him at the airport in Houston today. His plane was there 30 minutes early, and I was looking for my author. Excuse me. I found him and took him to my pickup truck. He didn't blink an eye. I brought him back to Beaumont, to a Sonic drive-in. Trooper, I have to say. It was a thoroughly delightful conversation. I just enjoyed it so much, and it was wide-ranging, and I know you'll enjoy it. Would all of you please welcome E.L. Doctorow.
Thank you, Professor Stiles, for your gracious introduction. I hadn't remembered that I was a New York State author. That's true, though. New York State has a bird, a muffin, and now an author. There's a lot of curiosity about how writers write. And I thought I'd talk about that this evening and try to explain how it happens that someone would come into this bizarre profession that is so different from the way most people make their living in this country. I will use my own experience by way of illustration of how these things happen, as long as you understand that it's different for different writers. But for me, I thought of myself as a writer for many years before I ever wrote a thing. It's a very effective way to begin. I suppose I started to think of myself as a writer when I was in the 3rd grade, and with such conviction that for many years I felt no obligation actually to write anything. Only once did I veer from this idea of myself. I was about 10 when I decided, in fact, that I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. And my older brother, wise beyond his age, said, "Oh, you only like the sound of those words, aeronautical engineer." And that was true. Of course, all this time that I imagined myself as a writer, I was reading constantly. I read enormous amounts. I read all the time. I was fortunate in growing up before television was widely available in everyone's home. I don't remember every author and every book, of course, but I know Raphael Sabatini was one of them, the author of the great novel Captain Blood, and Will James, not the brother of Henry, but the cowboy writer who wrote a wonderful novel about a horse called Smokey. I read all the Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes books. I read Howard Pease, an adventure writer, and John R. Tunis, who wrote terrific sports novels, and a writer named Joseph Altshuler, who wrote a marvelous novel about the Alamo. I read Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And then there was a period when I was reading nothing but mysteries, and my father, who I realize now always enjoyed knowing what I was reading, although he was very quiet and discreet about it. My father suggested to me that maybe there's something else beside mysteries and horror stories. And he did this in a characteristic way. We went to my grandfather's house one day. My grandfather had a personal library of books he had picked up in various kinds of promotion, book sets and encyclopedias, and multi-volume histories like the Harper's History of the Civil War, masterworks of all ages, in uniform editions that bore such titles as The World's Great Orations. This was my grandfather's library. He was a printer who had come here from Russia in the 1880s when he was very young and still single. And in the days of immigrant life, there was always great traffic in book promotions, and books with premiums you collected coupons for when you bought other things. And all the immigrants who were trying to catch up as fast as possible got these books. So my grandfather, who was a great reader, had one set of books he'd collected years before, all with the same green binding, I remember. And my father picked out one of them from the shelf and said, "Here, since you like horror mysteries, this might interest you. It's called The Green Hand." That sounds pretty horrible to me. So I thought, well, that's really terrific. And while all the grown-ups sat around drinking tea, I sat in the corner and read this book, and it wasn't The Green Hand, a Miss Horror story, mystery. It was a book about a novice aboard a sailing ship, a green hand. So by means of my father's trickery, I fell into the habit of reading about the sea, and I went through all my grandfather's whole set of sea novels, Captain Marryat and Moby Dick, The Wreck of the Grosvenor, right on up through later C.S. Forester's Horatio Hornblower novels. The major source of my reading was the public library. The very word library still calls up in my mind the neighborhood branch of the New York Public Library on Washington Avenue that I marched to each and every week. It was one of those libraries of oak shelves and tables of oak with great globe lights hanging from the ceiling on long chains. It was a bit of a walk from my house, and fittingly enough to get there, I had to pass a large bread baking factory, so I've always associated reading with the smell of delicious baked bread. Of course, it was exciting to be in the library, and invariably within minutes of my arrival, I would have to go to the bathroom. I remember the weekly experience of wandering through the stacks among all the shelves filled with library bindings with the books in gilt, covered with those thick library bindings with gilt-lettered titles and authors' names worn almost entirely away from handling. And libraries in those days hadn't figured out how to leave books in their original wrappers, so they disdained paperbacks, so the bindings were like steel, and I loved those worn-out books, big, thick novels that had been read so many times that the pages had a soft, pliant feel to them, like cloth. And I would pick out things that looked interesting, things I had no business reading, authors I discovered for myself without knowing who they were, Voltaire, Cervantes, Dostoevsky. I read whatever I could find by Jack London, and I read Mademoiselle de Maupin, a racy French novel that made my heart beat and my ears turn red. And Dumas, I was crazy about all the old swashbuckling novels, and Les Miserables, a book I read over one whole summer on the subway in New York City, going to the allergist every week for my shots. And it put those painful shots in perspective to know that Hugo's hero, Jean Valjean, had a tougher life than I had. I think I always managed to identify as a kind of older brother or sister the author of the story in my hands. That is to say, I could at once suffer the experiences of the characters of any given book, while at the same time appreciating the act of composition that was unfolding before me. And this appreciation could exist at the lowest level of my awareness, but it is indisputably an additional thing that happens to a young writer when he reads, which may not happen in the minds of other people, a feeling of bonding with the author, or more confusingly, an assumption that he or she and you were writing the book together as you read it. In fact, I do have an older brother to whom I've always looked up and who came home from World War II to study writing at the City College of New York. He was writing a novel during the course of a winter on his portable typewriter at night at the kitchen table in our house. It was a novel, as most novels those days were, about a veteran's adjustment, difficult adjustment to peacetime life. But here was our own family war hero, and was doing this incredible thing as if it were the act of a responsible adult. And I saw then, I was perhaps 13 or 14 at the time, that the idle dream sense I had of being a writer was indeed a practical possibility. And apparently, without realizing it, I also spent a good part of my childhood listening quite carefully to the conversations of adults, attending to the use of words at moments of high emotion, even when that emotion, anger, for instance, was directed at me. Apparently, I heard intonation and idiom and began to accept the different pacts between the speaker and the listener according to the formality or intimacy of the occasion. A teacher, for instance, standing in front of the classroom spoke quite differently when she was standing in the hallway addressing you alone. I also found myself drawn to those people, and there seemed to be a good many of them, fortunately, who were really good storytellers. Everyone in my family, my mother, my father, my brother, my aunts and uncles, was a good storyteller, by which I mean they were people to whom interesting things seemed to happen, and the events they spoke of were more often of a daily, ordinary sort, but when composed and narrated by the teller, they took on a great importance and excitement in me as I listened. Of course, not just adults, but children I knew had this ability to spin something out of nothing, which is the root of everything written. If you think about it, words, for all their substance, being things that are almost not there. I understand that, for instance, all Armenian folk tales begin with this sentence, once there was and was not. Of course, when you bring love to the person you're listening to, a story has to be interesting. And I'm quite aware that the task of a professional writer who publishes books is to overcome the terrible loss of not being someone the reader knows and loves. But apart from that, the people I listen to, in order to tell their stories, must have had a very firm view of themselves in the world. They must have been authorities of their own lives. They must have been strong enough as presences in their own minds to trust that people would listen to them when they spoke. So finally, I'll directly express my idea that, first of all, we writers make ourselves from a universal response to and capacity for storytelling. That whereas mathematics or physics are aptitudes given to relatively few, the aptitude for physics or mathematics are given to relatively few people, narrative seems to be within everyone's grasp. Perhaps because it's the very first means people ever had of understanding who they were and what was happening to them. One imagines a time when there was no distinction between fact and fiction, between religious perception and scientific discourse, between utilitarian communication and poetry, when all the functions of language, which we now divide and distinguish and use according to the situation we are in, were indivisible. A primary example in Western civilization, of course, being the Bible. Clearly, stories from the Bible are instructional. They are knowledge in the form of stories. They have a degree of compression, and their multiple truths are sometimes mysterious and require generation after generation of analysis and commentary. And they are still very much with us. So that our minds today, even as we're scientifically oriented, and as our courts demand evidence, and as our propositions demand verification, and as we naturally assume there are objective truths that can be discovered by empirical means, our minds today are still structured for storytelling. People think naturally in terms of conflict and its resolution, and in terms of character undergoing events, and of the outcome of events being not at all sure and therefore suspenseful, and the whole thing done, moreover, from a confidence of narrative that must belong to us and to our brains as surely as we have a predisposition to the protocols of grammar. Now, you can test that proposition not by looking at the number of works of fiction published in any season, but by looking at oral histories and reading what people have to say to the interviewers who record them. And there's a notable collection of such spoken memoirs called First Person Singular. And I'm going to quote now from a Southern man talking to an interviewer. And this is what he says. "If they hadn't tried to make a minister of me when I was a boy, I guess I could do good as a circus barker or a snake oil salesman. But I've got a little too much religion. Those early teachings about brotherly love caused me to pass up plenty." Now, the author of these sentences was a man named Josiah Roberts from Durham, North Carolina, and he spoke them to an interviewer in 1939. There's something called the Federal Writers Project, when writers, to give them something to do and work and salaries, were sent around the country to collect memoirs, spoken memoirs of people, and take down in their own words the stories of their lives. This kind of thing that Studs Terkel has made a career of. Yet, if you read them as the beginning of a story, these lines I just mentioned, you would keep reading. You would also perhaps smile in recognition of the narrator's wistful look at sin from the boring vantage of virtue, which happens to be a characteristic device of Mark Twain. Or listen to these lines, taken from a man down in Florida. He said, "I've crossed the channel in a storm with only a couple of inches of freeboard. We moved at night. Sometimes the customs pushed us so close we had to drop the load overboard. When they would get on our tail, we'd make a run for shallow water where we could lose them or at least drop the load and pick it up later on. I used to hate to have to throw stuff over in deep water." Close quote. Now, if this sounds to you like a passage out of Hemingway's To Have and Have Not, you're not far off the mark. The man who spoke these lines was a rum runner during Prohibition, and he was interviewed in Key West in 1938. I don't have his name to hand, but he was said to have been a drinking companion of Hemingway's and quite possibly the model for the character of Harry Morgan in that book. In any event, he knew, this rum runner, how to write prose according to the Hemingway ideal, stripping down his sentences to the clean, unattended nouns and simple verbs Hemingway decided were the means for getting things the way they were in life, so as to produce an emotion not by claiming it, but by rendering precisely the experience to cause it. And finally, here's the last example I'll use. It's my favorite, from a collection of oral histories by women who settled on the Kansas frontier in the 19th century, where they and their families were subjected to floods, droughts, plagues of locusts, and a series of topical ailments, most prominently ague, which we would call malaria. And here's the line that a neighbor wrote about a woman named Mrs. Briggs. "When Mr. Briggs was so with it," meaning the ague, "when Mr. Briggs was so with it that Mrs. Briggs had to cut the wood, she put the baby behind him on the corded bedstead where his shiverings joggled the baby off to sleep." Now think about that line. The neighbor who wrote about Mrs. Briggs and her husband, Mr. Briggs, knew what the master theorist of fiction, Flaubert, had articulated as a kind of revelation, that the way to make an object in fiction exist is to have it worked on by another object. Things flourish in transaction. Mr. Briggs' illness exists because he shivers, the bed exists because he lies upon it, and the sleeping baby exists because his father's malarial convulsions rock the bedstead. When Mr. Briggs was so with it that Mrs. Briggs had to cut the wood, she put the baby behind him on the corded bedstead where his shiverings joggled the baby off to sleep. This non-writing writer knew more, and so we know from Mrs. Briggs' action a good deal of her character, her enterprise in using even her husband's illness in her struggle for survival on the prairie. We know this life is harsh. We know further from this sentence alone the homemade nature of the house, what things look like outside the house, and in fact may derive from it the entire character of life on the American frontier in the 19th century. To perceive the world in terms of narrative is to write, but all through history there have been writers who didn't give a thought for setting anything down and who deny any ability to think three consecutive thoughts. The writers I've quoted, the prairie woman, the rum runner, the North Carolinian drummer with too much religion, have a voice and authorial presence that any professional has, however nervously, to recognize. And the fact is, when we read a good regional writer or native humorist or a master of modern diction, we are witness not only to the specific genius of a Mark Twain or an Ernest Hemingway, but of the genius of the people they speak for. This truth is sometimes neglected in modern literary life, where the act of literature is regarded as an expression of overriding individuation. Now, you may have noticed by this time that my remarks seem to be intent on breaking down distinctions. Readers who as children imagine that they're writers, ordinary people who speak written lines, and I'll take my deconstruction one step further and return to the biographical mode to do so. You remember we left me still reading and going on the subway to the allergist for my shots and watching my older brother write his returning veterans novel. I didn't do my first writing until I was in junior high school or middle school, 7th to 9th grades. Fact is, I had been named after Edgar Allan Poe. So naturally, I had read Poe, and now that I began to write, I wrote stories that took place in dungeons or dark houses that lacked central heating, and stories that began with lines like, "The cell was dark and dank." Perhaps here I should explain that the name was my father's idea. He loved Poe's work. He loved a lot of bad writers, but like James Fenimore Cooper, for example, but I'm consoled that Poe is our greatest bad writer. I questioned my mother about this a few years ago when she was in her late 80s. "Do you realize," I said, "that you and Dad named me after a delusional paranoid, addicted to drugs and alcohol, and possessed of strong necrophiliac tendencies?" She said, "Edgar, that's not funny." After my Poe period, I lay fallow for a while. I remembered getting all excited about something and then trying to write it and giving up after a paragraph or two and going out to play ball. And music set me off. In those days, there was a lot of radio drama, afternoon and evening, and so I'd get an idea and then put on a record player, some dramatic music of one kind or another, an opera overture, some boogie-woogie piano, and imagine it as the beginning of some scene or episode for a radio story that was going to come to me any minute. And then, as time passed, I found myself a student at the Bronx High School of Science. Perhaps you've heard of this school. It was a school filled with insufferably brilliant boys, several of whom were quite convinced, correctly as it turned out, that they would someday win Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry. Meanwhile, instead of doing the lab work, I was reading Kafka, his stories, Metamorphosis, The Penal Colony, and hanging out with the other displaced humanists in a little corner office where the school's literary magazine was published. The name of this magazine was Dynamo. Dynamos being the techno-chic things in those days that computers and laser beams and the internet are today. But I was desperate to write. It was a physical need. And when the opportunity came to enroll in a journalism class for the usual English course credit, I jumped at it. And we learned in that course all the usual elementary journalism things: how to write a lead, who, what, why, where, when, and so on, none of which interested me that much. But then one day the teacher gave out a big assignment. We were to conduct and write up an interview. We were to go out and interview someone, and I really went to town on that. I exercised initiative, I worked hard, and I turned in an interview with the stage doorman at Carnegie Hall on 57th Street in New York City. This man, the stage doorman, was a German Jewish refugee, prematurely aged, with rheumy eyes, who'd gotten out of Germany just ahead of Hitler, the only survivor in his entire family. He wore a worn, double-breasted blue serge jacket, unbuttoned, and a pair of baggy brown pants were too large for him. And each evening he brought his lunch to work in a paper bag with a thermos of hot tea. He drank his tea in the old world way by putting a cube of sugar between his teeth and sipping the tea through the sugar. His life had been shattered, but he had spirit, and it turned out he was very knowledgeable about music, and over the years he'd become a fixture in Carnegie Hall. It was his life, and all the great conductors and recitalists, Arturo Toscanini and Bruno Walter and Horowitz and Rubinstein, the pianist, and Jascha Heifetz, the violinist, knew him and called him by his first name, Carl the doorman. And the journalism teacher said, "Edgar, this is the best interview I've ever read in all my years teaching this class. I want to run it in the school newspaper. What we'll do is send one of the photography students downtown to take a picture of the old guy to go with your story." Well, I squirmed around a bit and said I didn't think it was possible that Carl would never let his picture be taken. "Why?" she asked. "Well," I said, he's very shy." "Well, how shy can he be?" she said. "He talked to you, didn't he?" "Well, not exactly," I said. There is no Carl the doorman. I made him up. Of course, the teacher was furious. I was in big trouble, sent to the principal's office, parents informed. But it seemed to me so much better to make up that stage doorman than actually go through the tedious business of interviewing someone. I thought if there wasn't a Carl the doorman, there should have been. And what about Kafka? After all, he wrote from his imagination about things that weren't verifiable from the real everyday world, but they were true. My teacher didn't realize the significance of this episode, the vast, portentous meanings attached to it, the first stirrings of my life and fate as a writer, and I probably didn't realize it either. When you're at that age, you tend to accept the judgment of others. In this case, not that I was born to write fiction, which is to say to seek the truth of the world in the artful mendacities of language, but that I was a kid with a grade of F. I wish I could describe from this point a clear ascending line of literary self-realization as I began to write seriously myself in college and afterward, but I think what happened is that the instinctive feel I had for fiction, the passion for it, somehow got buried in my collegiate education. I went to Kenyon College in Ohio, a very fine school, but at Kenyon in the 50s, we all practiced literary criticism. It was what we did there, the way they played football at Ohio State. And that was valuable, a rigorous training in the forms and structures and tropes of literary composition, but it was all analytical. The joy of it was cerebral, intellectual, which is not the joy of composition itself. And while I still wanted to write as badly as ever, I found I'd gone backwards, away from that natural surging need to express something, anything, to something else, if not backwards, then certainly up to the regions of the brain, to calculation, and to planning, and research, and the longings of the ego. And the truth of the matter is that writers write by giving all that up, giving up all the clutching, ego-driven intentions. And children know this without knowing they know it. The experience of the creative act doesn't fulfill the ego, but changes its nature. As you write, you are less the person you ordinarily are. The situation confers strength. An idea, an image, a scene comes to you as an act of discovery, and you don't possess what you write any more than the mountain climber possesses the mountain. But as I say, after college and after my Army service, I had lost intuitive purchase of this truth. I constructed outlines for books. I researched subjects for books. I intended to write books, and none of them got written. And then something happened that was really fortunate. I was by this time working as a professional reader for a film company I shouldn't name, Columbia Pictures. I read scripts and books and prepared synopses for the executives who didn't themselves care to read, or perhaps couldn't read, but were on the lookout for stories that could be adapted for the screen. And in these days, in the late 50s, Westerns were very popular. And so it was given to me to read one rotten Western after another. And I thought I would become seriously ill. I then decided that I could lie about the West better than any of the people I was reading. Full of anger and scorn, I put a piece of paper in the typewriter. We used typewriters in those days. And wrote chapter 1 at the top, just the way writers in movies do it. And that was how my first book came to be written, titled Welcome to Hard Times, a novel that takes place in the Dakota Territory in the 1870s. I was able to write that book because I had not planned to, and because I was not prepared to, never having been west of Ohio. I thought Ohio was the West, to tell you the truth. And the private excitement that got me going, apart from the instinct to parody the genre, was engendered by a wonderful geography book called The Great Plains by Walter Prescott Webb. And he said there were no trees in the West. And into my mind came this evocative image of a vast, barren, treeless plain, a land without trees that in fact tempered my desire to destroy the genre forever into using it seriously as a kind of counterpoint to what the reader would expect. And I thought I did a pretty good job of it too, that I pulled it off just as Kafka did in his novel America, which he wrote without ever having left Prague. But then after my book was published, I received a letter from an elderly lady who lived around here, as a matter of fact. It's a Texas postmark. And I knew she was elderly because it was on a very fine hand she wrote, shaky, fine hand. And she said the following: "Young man, I was with you all the way until chapter 7, where your Mr. Jenks at his campsite out on the flats made himself a dinner of the roasted haunch of a prairie dog. At that moment, I knew you'd probably never been west of Ohio," she said. "Because the roasted haunch of a prairie dog wouldn't fill a teaspoon," she said. Well, what was I going to do? I did the only thing I could do. I wrote back to her and said, the only thing I could say, "Well, of course, madam, that may be true of prairie dogs today, but in the 1870s, suggesting sort of a decline of the species, you know. But I've never corrected that mistake. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a story you may remember called The Birthmark, where a scientist insists on concocting a potion that will erase a tiny birthmark from his beautiful young wife's cheek, and so she will be perfect. And because she loves him, she drinks the potion, and the birthmark disappears from her face, and the moment it's gone and she's perfect, she dies. So in my arrogant fear of perfection, I have left Jenks still out there on the flats, having for dinner his roasted haunch of prairie dog. But the real point is this: only when I gave myself to the act of writing and trusted it to reveal to me what I wanted to write was I able to do something that did not entirely displease me. And that is how writers write, by trying to find out what it is they're writing. The painter Marcel Duchamp was once asked why he gave up painting, and he said, "Too much of it was filling in." The worker in any medium had best give it up if he finds himself only filling in what has been previously declared and completed in his mind, a creative fait accompli. It's not that you have no intellect when you write, and it's not that you have no convictions or belief. It is that nothing good can be expected from merely filling in what you already know. You must trust the act of writing to scan all the passions and convictions in your mind, but these must defer to the fortuitousness of the work. They must be of it. Now, I'll try to be a bit more precise about all of this, about trusting the act of writing and giving into it. What does it mean and how does it work? I have to confess it is really an elusive thing, and that once experienced by the writer, this fluid force, intuitive surge I'm speaking of is not forever his or hers. On the contrary, writers from the beginning of time have acknowledged this by speaking of this thing I'm speaking of, the muse. That's what I'm trying to find. I'm trying to find the muse. The muse is your own irresponsibility. The characteristic state of the writer is as profligate openness to words, to language, and the music language can make. What in a lover is fickle and mercurial and untrustworthy is the writer's morality, following the muse where she goes. Now, if there are any writing colleagues, fiction colleagues in this room, they'll have to forgive me for saying this, but the big dirty secret of all of us who write is that our seriousness is contingent upon whatever voice we can find to write in. I hope I'm not giving too much away here. But a book begins as an image in your mind, a sound in the ear, or a haunting of something you don't want to remember, or perhaps something like a great endowing anger. But it is not until you find a voice for whatever it is going on inside you that you can begin to make a coherent composition. The language precedes the intention, or if not, it is sure to transform it. Fiction is really an ancient way of knowing. It's an ancient system of knowledge. It is intuitive and undifferentiated knowledge that antedates all the specialty disciplines of a modern society, the sciences, the social sciences, all the media, the very idea of factual truth itself. Henry James, in his essay, The Art of Fiction, proposes a little parable to defend us all. He says that if a young woman who had lived a sheltered life walked past an army barracks and heard a fragment of soldiers' conversation coming through the window, she could, if she were a novelist, go home and write an accurate novel about army life. My life has not been sheltered, but I know I can hope to write well about places I've never seen and times before I was born and about people who are not me. And the secret in all of this is not the writer's talent. That may be visible to everyone, if not to the writer himself. The secret is that the discipline itself is capacitating, or as we've taken to saying lately, empowering. This is something else I didn't know or realize in my early days, that a sentence spun from the imagination, that is a sentence composed as a lie, confers on the writer a degree of perception or acuity or heightened awareness that a sentence composed with strictest attention to fact does not. Fiction is the only discipline that accepts all data from any source. In principle, it would exclude nothing. There are things the journalist cannot say. The journalist cannot permit himself to go inside someone's mind. There are words and concepts the scientist cannot permit himself if he's to do his science. The theologian's vocabulary is circumscribed, as is the philosopher's and the historian's. But you see, the fiction writer can take from any of them. He can derive from science and religion and history and reportage, but also from himself. His novel may trip into confession, into autobiography. He can appropriate legend, myth, dreams, or the mutterings of poor mad people in the street. Anything goes. All of it counts. All of it has equal weight. It is a great democratic discipline, fiction, a great big kitchen sink of possibilities. In fact, a mega discipline, the ultimate discourse, because it includes all the others. People are always curious about my beliefs. They ask me what I believe. I believe in fiction. Fiction to me is not an embellishment, a cultural decoration hung on the important work or business of life. In fact, it's a system of knowledge, a crucial means of knowing, perhaps the very first means of knowing, the total discourse that antedates all the special vocabularies of modern intelligence. I didn't know that either when I began. The professional writer of fiction is a conservative, a word I never thought I could apply to myself, a conservative who cherishes the ultimate structures of the human mind. He cultivates within himself the universal disposition to think in stories. But for all its powers, literature does not call upon followers. It is invariably bipolar, the doubt always imminent in the assertion. There's always a no inside the yes and a yes inside the no. It pervades moral complexity and paradox and irony, pathos and human failure, and the failure, comic or tragic, of human institutions. It's a mirror of the irresolute human soul. It says this is how it feels. This is the truth of the felt life. In so doing, it confounds simplistic belief, resists the constriction of freedom that attaches to society's aggregate fictions, which by their inertia instill a stupor of thought. But literature, for all of that, does not call upon followers. Now, I refer, of course, to literature since the Bronze and Iron Ages, because the ancestral literatures of those times, the sacred texts of our religions, by reason of their attributed authorship, do call upon followers. The scriptures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were produced or revealed in those ages when stories were all people had and when their invention was the word of God. Those residual communal texts that have made us who we are were hard-won instructions for survival and discoveries of the intellect that were configured illustratively so as to be transmittable by memory from person to person long before they came to be written. They gave counsel, they connected the present with the past, they bound the visible to the invisible, and they distributed the suffering so that it could be born. And as with the stories of today, they made no distinction between fact and fiction, between ordinary communication and heightened language. But for all of that, they were not self-conscious literary acts. It's as if in ancient times only God or his prophets and priests could hold such a esteemed title as author. The sacred texts of all the religions have been communally amended, rewritten, commented upon, interpreted by rabbis, by priests, by imams, in order to transform religious apprehension into churches and unmediated awe into dogma and inchoate feeling into sacrament and brute expression into ethical commandments. But the authorship of God through his representatives is uncontested. And if a portion of a sacred text is illogical or opaque or self-contradictory or bipolar or enigmatic, God in his authorial perfection is not to be called into question, only we, his readers, for our inadequacies. Now, in the histories of civilizations, the right of authorship has fallen and devolved from God and his prophets to everyone. Wars have been fought, orthodoxies have been thrown off, human consciousness has gone through revolutions, and human beings have been reconceived in freedom in order for this to have happened. In a modern world deprived by rationalism and science of the comprehensive magic of a divinely conceived universe. All authors are recognized as mortal, and every story has to make it on its own. And when such geniuses as Bacon and Galileo insisted on putting claims of knowledge to the test with observation and experiment, storytelling as the prime means of understanding the world was so reduced in authority that today it is only children who continue to believe that stories are, by the fact of their being told, true. Children and fundamentalists. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American transcendentalist, preacher, essayist, and poet, has a line about a writer. He says, "The writer believes all that can be thought can be written. In his eyes, a man is the faculty of reporting." He doesn't mean just journalism there. In his eyes, a man is the faculty of reporting, and the universe is the possibility of being reported. And since September 11th, I've been thinking about those lines and about the ancient writings. And of course, there are hard, real political understandings to apply to the rise of global terrorism. But taking our cue from Emerson, we might describe the terror inflicted by the religiously brainwashed nihilists of Al-Qaeda as arising from that part of the world where, for many people, the universe is not the possibility of being reported because it has been accounted for, attributed in its entirety, now and forever, by a supreme author. It's inconceivable in an absolute theocracy, a country run by religious diktat, inconceivable in any society where the answers are already given and the rules of life are inflexible and the authority for all thought is the ruling modality, that the free expression and the multiplicity of witness, which is what Emerson is talking about, can be anything but an abomination, a danger to the state or an affront to God, God or the state having done all the writing that was necessary for anyone for all time. And so the underlying conflict to come, if it does, might be understood as between the old stories and the new, or between the fanatical readers of the old and the pertinent writers of the new, between the ancient revealed as divine writings and the writings of our later civilizations whose authors are mortal, multiple, and while lacking any holy credential or indeed necessary exemption from evil of their own, are engaged in reporting the universe. I will say of fiction, too, and speaking personally, that as the practice of persons working alone, independent of all institutions, and with no obligations to any of them, that fiction, as it did in old, reasserts the authority of the single mind to make and remake the world, and that there is a naturally inhering social value to it when it's done well. Fiction gives counsel, as it always did. It connects the present with the past. It bonds the visible to the invisible and distributes the suffering so that it can be borne. And fiction says we must compose ourselves in our stories in order to exist. And it says, if we don't do it, someone else will do it for us. Thank you very much.
Well, it was my pleasure to join him for dinner and to have the opportunity to listen to a conversation about what writers do. And I asked about writing as a process because I'd had a friend who said that writers were madmen, architects, carpenters, and judges. And that in fact he's all of those, and was a really enjoyable conversation tonight with you. I want to finish with two pieces. One is to say that we become what we are, which is a quote from Alex Cross in Along Came a Spider, one of those great, memorable movies. But you have become what you are, which is the writer, which is what you've told us about tonight. And we're very pleased that you shared the journey with us. And then I would like to take just a second to thank the committee, the steering committee. If they'll stand, I don't know if we can get lights. If we can stand, Sally is not here, Dr. Joanne Stiles, Dr. Bruce Dury, Dr. Donna Birdwell-Sykes, Joel Smith, Lisa Hicklin, and Michelle Warner. And is that it? Thank you very much for selecting someone so wonderful to come visit with us. As you saw on your program, Dr. Doctorow will be available to sign his book, and Tamara is going to be speaking on the 8th floor of the library at 9:30. We'll welcome all of you to come and ask questions and to talk to him and learn more about his journey in life. Thank you.